Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Arsalan Arif, the publisher of Endpoints News, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rowe, and our topic is on optimizing your end of phase 2 meeting. I'm joined by two top experts from Rowe, Kevin Barber, who is the company's Vice President of Regulatory Strategy and Submissions, and David Shoemaker, Rowe's Senior Vice President of R&D. They have an approximately 40-minute presentation, followed by a Q&A session. Attendees may ask questions at any time during the webinar using the control panel software. We will get to as many as possible. Okay, let's get started. We'll begin with Kevin Barber, followed up by David Shoemaker. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Barber. Kevin, take it away.
Thank you very much, Arsalan. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today, and we're looking forward to reviewing the material and the guidance on optimizing your end of phase 2 meeting. I'm glad that all of you could join us, and David and I are both very excited to go through our presentation today. So by way of introduction, these are the topics that we want to cover during our webinar. I will cover the first two topics with respect to readiness for the end of phase 2 meeting and then preparation for the meeting. And then I'll turn it over to David, starting with conduct of the meeting, and he will cover the final 4 bullet points here. So let's jump right in. The first thing that you need to consider as you anticipate an end of phase 2 meeting is really, are you truly ready to participate and engage with FDA in an end of phase 2 discussion? So to get started, let's review the goals of an end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA. At a very high level, the two primary goals in meeting with FDA and engaging with them at the end of phase 2 meeting is, first and foremost, clarity across your overall development program. Do you have clarity both internally, and are you in a position to meet with FDA and discuss with them the status of your full development program across all of the disciplines? Because going into that meeting and then coming out of that meeting, you want to be in a position to meet the second primary goal of the meeting, which is achieving alignment and agreement across all of the stakeholders involved in your development program, including FDA as the regulator and everyone on your team involved in the development of your product through phase 3 and to an eventual marketing application. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the questions that you need to ask yourself to ensure that you are truly ready to go in and engage FDA in an end of phase 2 meeting. What I want to review here are across the various disciplines involved in your development program, some of the top level questions that you need to ask. And these are not all encompassing, but these are key questions across the disciplines that you need to cover. So first and foremost, from a clinical standpoint, are you truly ready to conduct your adequate and well-controlled registration studies to support a future marketing application? The first consideration there is, have you truly demonstrated the clinical proof of concept for your product and its indication? And I'll talk about that a bit further on a subsequent slide. Hand in hand with that, and equally important, do you have a primary clinical endpoint in mind that you are in a position to propose to FDA that you've taken through phase 2, and this endpoint needs to be one that you are in a great position to get alignment with FDA and agreement that it's the appropriate one to use in your phase 3 development program. And then just as important, do you have a strong justification for your proposed treatment regimen? Have you demonstrated an appropriate dose response such that you can present to FDA the optimal dose and dosing regimen for the treatment that you are proposing to carry forward into your phase 3 program? With respect to clinical pharmacology, some of the key questions are shown here. First and foremost, with respect to ClinPharm, You should have have already completed most of your clinical pharmacology work. You should have an understanding of the pharmacokinetics, the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of your product. You need to understand whether there are special populations that you need to assess for your development program and have those studies well in hand. And also highlighted here are considerations around drug-drug interaction studies. Do you have those studies well in hand, either in progress, planned appropriately, or completed at this point? We've often seen sponsors in the development of their products wait until late in the game to consider DDI studies, for example. So you need to make sure that you have your overall clinical pharmacology program advanced to the point that you're ready to engage with FDA at the end of phase 2, and that you have all the information that you need to inform and enable your phase 3 studies from a clin pharm, PD, and PK standpoint. Statistical considerations are absolutely at the top of the list for your phase 3 development program. So if you don't have a very well experienced and well grounded statistician involved in your development program, you need to make sure that you engage one and have that person as one of the key stakeholders on your development team, because some of the most important considerations going into and coming out of your phase 3 development program are the analyses of the data and the right assumptions for how you are going to develop your phase 3 analysis plan and plan for success coming out of phase 3. So what we've highlighted here on this slide are some of the key considerations from a statistical standpoint going into your end of phase 2 meeting. First and foremost on that is, do you have an understanding of the effect size, and is it clinically meaningful? Second of all, have you identified the patient population appropriately? And do you have an understanding of how you're going to handle incomplete or missing data from your phase 3 study? This is actually a topic that is high on FDA's list coming out of into phase 2 meetings. They often provide a great deal of guidance around the handling of incomplete and missing data. So you want to make sure you're on top of the methodologies and the statistical approaches for handling missing data. With respect to your preclinical program, you should have already completed all the studies that are necessary to inform your phase 3 development program from a safety as well as from an appropriate non-clinical pharmacology standpoint. You may still be in the process of conducting some NDA or BLA enabling studies such as carcinogenicity studies, but you should be in a position to walk in the door to FDA for your end of phase 2 program and present to them what you have completed and what you're planning to do for non-clinical, and they get their buy-in that you've checked all the boxes and that you are not missing any critical preclinical studies to support an eventual NDA or BLA. With respect to chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, of course, across the different types of products, small molecules, biologics, biotech products, and perhaps combination products, there are a number of CMC questions that need to be addressed as you assess your readiness for an end of phase 2 meeting. Again, these are some examples of the questions across these types of products that you need to consider in this slide and in the next slide. But overall, across your development program from a CMC standpoint, you want to be in a position to present to FDA that the investigational product that you are taking into phase 3 is representative of your to be commercialized product. And so you need to make sure that you have the final formulation squared away. You want to make sure that your analytical methods and specifications are in great shape and that you can anticipate FDA's feedback and not be surprised by their feedback on that. Do you have your manufacturing process squared away? Are there any potential manufacturing site changes that you may need to address with FDA in terms of how to handle those? Because the last thing that you want to do coming out of phase 3 is to deal with any bridging studies because you've changed something in your manufacturing that calls into potential question your phase 3 clinical results. So you need to consider these questions across the board as you assess your readiness for an end of phase 2 meeting. Regulatory, of course, crosses all the disciplines in terms of the feedback and the interactions that you've had with FDA to date, leading to this point in your development program. But at a high level, of course, you've received all along feedback from FDA, both in writing and as well as from their guidance. So as you prepare for consideration about an end of phase 2 meeting, have you reviewed all of the recommendations, the requests, the questions that have come from FDA, and have you gone through and checked those off in terms of how you intend to address those? There may be some that you need further dialogue with FDA. There may be some that you don't believe you need to comply with, and so you need to be prepared to approach FDA at the end of phase 2 meeting and address those accordingly. And finally, as you've gone through your phase 2 development, you may have generated additional clinical data and other data that could support regulatory designations such as breakthrough therapy designation and so on. And so you need to take a look at that and consider what you may do with the additional data and assess if there are additional regulatory designations to consider at this phase. I mentioned earlier demonstration of proof of concept. I think this is getting up on a soapbox a little bit, but I will say that historically the landscape in product development is littered with companies that have rushed into phase 3 without being appropriately prepared, without demonstrating clinical proof of concept. So you should not consider going to FDA and meeting with them to discuss your development program at end of phase 2 until you have convinced yourself and all the key stakeholders, as well as independent, unbiased arbiters, that your product is likely to succeed in phase 3, and checking all the boxes to increase your likelihood of success and reduce the risk in your phase 3 program by having demonstrated clinical proof of concept. So again, an unbiased independent assessment of your program and of your clinical proof of concept is the best insurance that you can have going into phase 3. And finally, you need to make sure that you're ready to comply with pediatric requirements. Your proposed pediatric study plan is due shortly after the end of phase 2 meeting, so you shouldn't schedule your end of phase 2 meeting until you have a solid pediatric development program that addresses all the considerations that you would include in your pediatric study program, including justification for any waivers or deferrals. And you need to take advantage of the end of phase 2 meeting to get feedback from FDA on your pediatric development approach and get some preliminary alignment from FDA so that you're not surprised by any feedback they give you when you do submit your PSP for review by the agency. So those are a lot of the key questions that you need to ask, and I highlight those because the end of phase 2 meeting is probably the single most important interaction that you can have with FDA in your development program to make sure that as you move into phase 3 and you expend the resources and the finances that you need to focus on your phase 3 program, that you've optimized your chances for success in your development program. So with that in mind, let's talk about preparing for the end of phase 2 meeting and start with some initial timing considerations. Overall, assuming you have been moving your development program forward appropriately, it's still going to take on the order of 4 to 6 months to truly prepare appropriately for an end of phase 2 meeting. And that encompasses analyzing your data across the board, preclinical, clinical, CMC, and so on, reviewing all of your regulatory communications and correspondence to make sure that you are appropriately addressing any commitments and guidance and recommendations from FDA. And from a CMC standpoint, as I alluded to earlier, you need to be in a position to manufacture a batch of material that represents your commercial product and generate the supportive batch analysis and data from that and start your stability program to support an eventual NDA. So again, to reiterate, it's going to take a fair amount of time to analyze and assess and make sure that you're ready to go, and you should not begin preparing your end of phase 2 meeting package until you've done that appropriate analysis. You need to have that analysis and consideration in hand in order to truly understand what you need to do to prepare your briefing package with the appropriate questions and supporting material. And it's best, of course, as you generate data throughout your development program, that you don't wait until the last minute as you think you need to go into an end of phase 2 meeting. Don't wait until then. You need to analyze the data all along and prepare for an end of phase 2 meeting by anticipating the questions and the considerations that you need to ask FDA based on the data that you generate. Overall, what I'm alluding to is a gap analysis. You need to have an independent assessment of your program and the data that you've generated to date, ideally by clinical stats, preclinical CMC experts, ones who are experienced and have taken products to market in the past. And then you can be in a position to move forward with your end of phase 2 meeting. Hand in hand with this, if you don't have a target product profile already in place, now is the time to develop one. And again, it's useful from earlier stages of development, but definitely you should have one by the time you're ready to talk to FDA at the end of phase 2. So the next 2 slides, we'll talk about the briefing book preparation and the question development, and these go hand in hand, and it's a very iterative process. So very briefly, the meeting package or briefing book, the purpose of this is to fully inform and educate FDA regarding your development program, the status of the program, the data that you have available to inform and enable your phase 3 program, and what your plans are and the justification for your phase 3 program. You don't want this briefing book to be too long. Generally, even per FDA guidance, they recommend brevity, so on the order of 50 to 75 pages max to allow FDA to review it appropriately. And in order to summarize all the data, you need to have a great deal of planning and good skills in pulling the information together in an appropriate style and format. And throughout this, you need to identify what the key issues that you need to talk to FDA about, what those issues are, and then prioritize those issues to drive the content of the briefing package and the questions that you need to ask. And again, as we talked about, the package should include all aspects of your development program, including, for example, the pediatric plan. So hand in hand with the briefing document content, you will be developing the questions to pose to FDA. As I mentioned already, in terms of considering the end of phase 2 meeting and your phase 3 program, what are the key issues that you need to discuss with FDA? In terms of the questions themselves, you need to keep in mind that FDA is not a consulting firm. You don't go to FDA and ask them questions about your development program that you should be able to answer with input from industry professionals and individuals and subject matter experts on your team outside of the agency. The questions that you ask FDA should not be open-ended. They should present to FDA what your plan is and the justification for that plan for the specific issue. Present the plan to FDA and then ask FDA if they agree. And you need to do this across the board for all disciplines within your development program to get alignment with FDA on your phase 3 program to position you for marketing application in the wake of a successful phase 3 program. It is possible that you may have a number of very substantive issues to talk to FDA about. So in a typical end of phase 2 meeting, you're generally only going to have 60 minutes to meet with FDA. So as you prepare for your meeting, as you prepare the briefing package and frame out your questions, if you see that you have more than about 4 or 5 substantive issues that you believe you will need to discuss with FDA during the meeting, we would recommend that you consider breaking the meeting up into separate clinical, preclinical, statistical end of phase 2 meeting, and then a CMC end of phase 2 meeting. FDA actually recommends this strongly. So, so if it looks like you can't cover everything in a single 60-minute meeting based on your development program and the considerations you have for discussion with FDA, we would recommend asking for 2 separate meetings. And you can do the CMC meeting as well as the clinical meeting in close proximity with one another, ideally within about a month or 2. So I hope you notice I haven't said one word yet about the meeting request. The meeting request really shouldn't be developed until you have a full understanding of your data and you have a very mature briefing book. You've already started crafting your questions as part of guiding your briefing book preparation and assessing the key issues that you need to discuss with FDA. So once you have an idea of when you will have a final briefing package ready to submit to FDA, you're in a position to begin preparing your meeting request hand in hand with finalizing your briefing package. And I'll highlight why that's important with respect to FDA's timelines here in just a moment. But again, once you have the package far enough along, you can begin preparing the meeting request per FDA's meeting guidance. Another consideration as you prepare your meeting request is sponsor attendees. You need to take the appropriate people to the meeting with the FDA as subject matter experts to address the issues and the questions that you are posing to FDA and to be able to respond to the feedback that FDA provides. So across the board, you need the subject matter experts across all the disciplines that are involved in your development program. You also need a very experienced moderator who's completely familiar with the development program and experienced in negotiating and working with FDA. And you need someone in the room to take notes, whose sole presence in the meeting is to assemble a verbatim transcript of the meeting. We recommend that you do not take executive leadership within your company and don't take your company's legal attorneys either. We would discourage their attendance at the meeting and they don't need to be there. Part of the activity involved in finalizing your briefing document, finalizing your meeting request, and the questions that you want to pose to FDA is anticipating FDA's concerns for your development program. So as you go through and think about what FDA has recommended in your development program to date and where you are with respect to the data and informing your phase 3 program, think about FDA's concerns. And you can't do this too early in your process. The earlier you can do this, the better in terms of informing your briefing package and your interaction with FDA. And you can keep these in mind as you begin your rehearsal, as you wait for FDA's preliminary written responses once they've had a chance to review your briefing package. So, spent a fair amount of time talking about preparing your package, preparing your questions. I haven't said one word about the timing until now. The timing laid out here is per FDA's guidance. The meeting is generally scheduled within approximately 70 days after FDA receives the meeting request. Your briefing book, however, is due 50 days before the meeting date. And FDA has 14 days to reply to your request for a meeting. So it doesn't give you much time between the moment you send that meeting request letter out the door to when your package is going to be due at FDA if they grant you a date that you have requested in the letter. So you need to make sure, again, I can't emphasize this enough, you need to make sure that that meeting package is ready to go before you even send the letter in asking for the meeting. Within FDA's guidance, they highlight that they will try to provide preliminary written responses to your questions no later than 5 days before the meeting. That would put you in a position to look at their responses, consider the key issues based on their responses, the key questions that you want to discuss, and then follow up with FDA before the meeting on the specific questions that you want to spend time during the meeting in discussion with the FDA. So this just shows the same information except in a calendar format, but I hope it highlights to you the timing on this and how quickly things happen over that 70-day period from the moment you send in the meeting request letter. The briefing book is due very quickly after that. And then you would spend the bulk of the time leading up to the meeting itself, preparing for the meeting, rehearsing, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. So we generally recommend a minimum of 2 rehearsals to prepare for FDA. I usually like to devote at least a half a day for each one, a focus group of all the attendees who are going to be participating in the meeting. Before you receive FDA's preliminary written responses, you should still go through the exercise of looking at each question that you're posing to FDA and generate what you believe FDA's potential responses are, favorable as well as unfavorable, so that you can consider all the possibilities that FDA may respond with. So as you generate FDA's potential responses, you want to go through the process of assigning the right individuals from your team to be responsible for responding to FDA if those questions end up being ones that you discuss during the meeting itself. So go through potential FDA responses, pull together your follow-up questions and follow-up discussion points with FDA based on their potential responses, and begin practicing and rehearsing as you wait for FDA to provide you with their actual preliminary responses in the days before the meeting. Another thing to highlight is if you have any foreign visitors who will be attending on your behalf, FDA will highlight this in their letter granting the meeting, but make sure that you interact with the FDA project manager and provide all the appropriate paperwork so that you don't have any hangups in terms of getting those people through security and into the room the day that you meet with FDA. We also, of course, highly recommend having an on-site rehearsal the day prior to the meeting in Washington, DC. So as you plan for the meeting, make sure that you reserve a meeting room at a hotel near White Oak, near the FDA. Hopefully by the time you travel to DC, you will have FDA's preliminary responses in hand. Again, they target trying to get those to you for an end of phase 2 meeting no later than 5 days before the meeting. However, FDA has been known to provide preliminary responses as late as the morning of a meeting, although they do seem to be getting better over time. So with that in mind, you need to be on site, and if you have FDA's responses in hand, then you're in a position to go through those responses, triage them. If you've done a good job of anticipating potential FDA responses, this will be a much more efficient process. But the point here is that you go through the responses and identify which ones that you want to talk to FDA about in the meeting itself, and then rehearse with respect to the discussion points that you want to have with FDA in the meeting itself. A key point here as well is that if you have attendees who've never been to an FDA meeting, make sure that you coach them appropriately on how to behave during the meeting. Don't speak unless they're called upon to speak. Other aspects of the meeting logistics itself, so that you can have an appropriate, productive meeting with the FDA. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Shoemaker to cover the remaining topics. David?
Thanks, Kevin. So now we're going to get into the actual conduct of the end of phase 2 meeting. And I'll start with a couple of common sense suggestions. Check egos at the door. There's no sense in getting into a who is right argument with FDA. It takes you off track, it wastes time, and it serves no purpose in moving your product forward to the market. Also, check any concerns that you have about the dollars that are going to be required to do this work at the door. Pharmaceutical development is a very expensive endeavor. If you don't have the money, you need to get into another industry. Please bring a official picture ID. A passport works well, and science will win the day at this meeting, I can assure you. So for the meeting conduct itself, obviously safety is the FDA's major concern, being a public health agency, and that's from all perspectives, clinical, preclinical, and CMC. So as Kevin said, you need to practice your responses if you have any soft underbellies with regard to safety that the FDA may raise, and you need to practice those answers repeatedly so that you have it down pat and you don't meander in your thinking or your speaking. However, at the end of phase 2 meeting, the second most important topic is efficacy. And this is just the turning point in your program. You need to get agreement on the concept, the proof of concept, and also the design of your phase 3 studies. If you walk out and FDA doesn't think you have proof of concept, you're not going to be going in the right direction. And if you don't have agreement on the design of your phase 3 studies, you're going to have to go through several more rounds of interaction with FDA. So that's the goal for this meeting, as Kevin said earlier. And ensure you take enough minute takers. Everyone should be a minute taker. There's no one who's absolved from the minute taking responsibility. The number of ears that you have in that room is very important. We endeavor to get a verbatim transcript of what happens at the meeting, identifying every question that FDA asks and who the FDA reviewer is that's asking a question, because it makes a big difference whether the question is coming from the medical reviewer or the non-clinical pharm tox reviewer. And that puts things in context. And once you have a verbatim transcript, it's much easier to assemble your minutes to go back to FDA. So as you go into the room, it seems that more and more these days, you walk in, the FDA is already sitting there on the other side of the table. It used to be in the old days when I was coming up, you could intermingle, and it led to a lot more informal meetings and conversations after the meeting. But now it's much more mano a mano in the meeting room. And so you need to have an experienced moderator who's going to survey the situation, has already identified the speakers that are going to address each of the questions that come up. And the moderator needs to work with those speakers or those experts on what you're willing to compromise on. As Kevin said, you will have received the FDA's initial responses before you walk into that room. Hopefully you have winnowed those responses down to the 5 or 6 critical ones that you need to address and get resolved in this meeting, and the others can just be put to bed very quickly. And you can go in with a slide deck prepared that only has the critical issues on it and just say everything else in the initial responses from FDA are acceptable. It's also important to note that FDA will rarely change a black and white established position at the meeting. They have held their pre-meeting, they've made decisions. They may have people that disagree on the team with that decision, but the decision is the decision. And so I've been at meetings where, you know, our medical officer has gone toe to toe with the medical officer at FDA for a half an hour, and the only concession I got was the division director looking at me and saying the topic is not completely closed at this point in time. And that particular argument resulted in FDA changing their position a month later, but they're not going to do it in a meeting, so don't push for it any harder than you have to. Provide all the scientific and medical justification that you can. And you obviously need experienced disciplinary experts in each critical area, as Kevin talked about. And if you don't have them in your company, you need to hire them, because people experienced in negotiating with FDA and CMC and preclinical toxicology are just essential at this point in time, and as well as physicians to negotiate with the physicians at FDA. And we also talked about the possibility already of having a CMC-focused end-of-phase 2 meeting. There's a lot to cover, and to be honest, I've seen more of this in the past 5 years than ever with the advent of gene transfer and more complex manufacturing schemes. The NDAs and the BLAs are becoming more CMC heavy than they have been in the past, and so it's obviously the division's prerogative, but you can make a strong case for having 2 meetings and taking the CMC into its own arena. It should be conducted at approximately the same time as the clinical/preclinical meeting, but the goal is to get all of these activities tied up in a bow so that you can start heading towards your NDA or BLA. So the wrap up of your end of phase 2 meeting is essentially ensuring that you summarize all the commitments and action items, and this starts right at the end of the meeting. Your moderator should take careful attention to all the things that you said you were going to do and itemize them out so that both the consumer safety officer or the regulatory project manager at FDA can get them down, as well as your company's team. Do not discuss the meeting until you are back at the hotel. I have met many FDA employees who have regaled with laughter as they told stories of people discussing their meeting as they were walking through the halls of FDA, and they were overheard and played back to the team. Get back to the hotel and debrief immediately. You don't think that this is that hard to remember, but you'd be amazed at how quickly conversations fade. And reach consensus on the FDA's perspectives for each critical issue. There will be disagreement within your team on what the FDA said, what the tone was, what was the facial expression on the toxicologist or the medical reviewer, and all of that needs to be captured if you're truly to understand what FDA's position is. And then once you have the verbatim transcript, write that into a organized meeting minutes and get it back to the FDA quickly, because the regulatory project manager or consumer safety officer oftentimes will use your minutes in helping them construct their minutes, and then there's really a consensus between the two organizations. FDA's minutes will not be coming to you until 30 days after the meeting. Post-meeting activities include basically headed towards the NDA, getting the plan together to put your product on the market. You now have, if you conducted a successful end of phase 2 meeting, all the information you need to put together that end stage of development where you work your phase 3 clinical studies and complete your manufacturing activities. Hopefully, as Kevin said, there won't be much preclinical to do. And so it should be a relatively simple task. Nonetheless, some people don't do this at this point in time, and they really miss an opportunity. And you should be able to arrive at an estimate of the date for the marketing submission for the NDA or BLA. But I would not run out and tell your investors or your stockholders that, because things inevitably can go wrong. But just work the plan from this point on if you've had a good end of phase 2 meeting. So some common themes that you might see if you haven't prepared well for your end of phase 2 meeting is in minutes back from FDA, we don't agree that you're ready for phase 3. You need to do additional phase 2 studies to determine your dose or dose regimen. The secondary endpoints are not appropriate, and that should be vetted out before it should ever get to FDA. There's enough information from experts in the industry to address all of FDA's concerns if you only ask. A lot of questions we see from clients are sort of questions optimistically thinking that FDA is going to be able to answer the question without seeing the data. That's impossible. They have to see the data before they can ask if your product is ready for approval. And so premature questions are to be avoided, and the proposed efficacy analysis in your draft protocol is insufficient. That's just, it can't help but hurt you if you want to tie off a successful end of phase 2 meeting. And I think more and more there's some sort of virus out there. Everybody thinks they can get by with one clinical trial in phase 3, and that's just not happening if you don't have a serious or life-threatening disease. And so we see this standard reference referring to the 1998 clinical evidence of effectiveness guidance in some of the minutes that we review. We work with a lot of companies in helping them submit their NDAs and BLAs, and consequently, they come to us with their end of phase 2 meetings. And in some cases, they're in good shape. In other cases, their end of phase 2 meeting was very premature. So other common responses, one of the things that I've had happen to me once and never again was for a division to tell me to submit our special protocol assessment at the end of the end of phase 2 meeting. That is to be avoided at all costs because that's another round of review at FDA for your phase 3 protocols. So you want to ensure that what you submit in your end of phase 2 meeting is a complete and comprehensive phase 3 protocol with all the statistical analyses very clear. It doesn't have to, you don't necessarily have to include the full statistical analysis plan in the end of phase 2 meeting package, but your protocol should make it clear enough to FDA what the statistical analysis plan is if you're going to get agreement on the design and move forward into phase 3. Kevin talked about missing data. Validation reports for analytical methods are a common missing element, and test specifications for things like particle size for your drug substance or drug product, and please explain why testing for some metabolite of concern to FDA is not performed. That's another topic for discussion as well, and FDA will harp on that. So with that, I'm going to move quickly to the end of phase 1 scenario. These are, as I said before, are for serious or life-threatening illnesses. The regulations are there, but the first question you must ask yourself is, do you have a validated surrogate endpoint? If not, you may be better off doing 2 adequate and well-controlled studies. And the reason for that is that the validation of a novel surrogate clinical endpoint is no picnic, as anybody who's done it would attest to. This is the holy grail. You see the red circle, that's having an end of phase 1 meeting early on and only conducting 1 phase 2, phase 3. That enables you to get your NDA or BLA submitted early, and compared to the standard development in the track above, you save many dollars during development as well as get your product on the market. The problem is, if you look down at the bottom of the slide, there's a surrogate endpoint validation study, and that is what I refer to as not being easy, and consequently can take almost as much time as doing phase 2 and 2 phase 3 studies as well. So if you're going to think about this pathway and having an end of phase 1 meeting, you might want to ensure that you have a surrogate endpoint validated. You can also conduct end of phase 1 meetings for rare diseases. This is happening more and more as we move to personalized medicine. The products are so rare in some cases, and the diseases are so rare that many clients do not understand what the genotypic and phenotypic conditions of their disease are, and they'll jump into clinical studies before really understanding how their disease manifests itself over the course of a human life. So that's something that you really need to work on. And again, you need a regulatorily validated clinical endpoint to proceed with these studies. And typically, if you don't have a regulatorily validated clinical endpoint, the FDA is going to want to compare your results in your study to a historical control. So you had better start your natural history study right now. And these types of diseases play well into the adaptive design that is very popular in the literature right now. But I want to emphasize that adaptive designs are extremely complicated and must be done well in advance of the end of phase 1 meeting. This would be a primordial topic for discussion at the end of phase 1 meeting. And many companies have failed at this stage of development due to poor design of the trial that's going to demonstrate efficacy of their product to FDA. The differences consequently between the end of phase 1 meeting and the end of phase 2 is that clinical is moving so quickly that preclinical and CMC data lag behind and are playing catch up with clinical. The FDA is more likely to accept more risk with the products that are targeted for life-threatening and serious diseases, but The questions basically are the same. You have to get the FDA to be comfortable with the safety clinically, preclinically, and CMC for these programs. And since clinical is moving so quickly, it may require you request another Type B meeting for preclinical and CMC discussions after the end of phase 1 meeting. But if you are not talking with FDA about an end of phase 1 meeting at your pre-IND meeting, you are too late to take real advantage of this program. Because if it's an afterthought, if you finish your phase 1 study and say, oh, let's have an end of phase 1 meeting, you're really dragging your company down and you're taking a lot of time. So I would encourage you, if you have a product that's this exciting, to start talking with FDA about it at the pre-IND meeting. So in summary, the end of phase 2 meeting is not just any other FDA meeting. We must have obtained clinical proof of concept in order to proceed to an end of phase 2 meeting or proceed expecting to fail. Must be aware of all aspects of your data before you are ready for an end of phase 2 meeting. And the preparation of the end of phase 2 meeting is, in our experience, typically 4 to 6 months if it's done well. And again, the end of phase 1 meeting is an option for serious and life-threatening and rare diseases, but you need to lay the groundwork for the end of phase 1 meeting at the pre-IND meeting. And with that, I will stop the presentation and turn it back for questions.
All right, that was a great presentation. Thank you very much, Kevin and David. And with the time we have remaining, let's get to questions from the audience here. And for our first question, how many sponsor attendees should we include in the end of phase 2 meeting?
So this is Kevin. I'll take this question. I guess the short answer is you need the right number of attendees. That sounds kind of trite, but the bottom line is, as we reviewed in our presentation, you have the facilitator, the moderator, you have someone dedicated to taking notes, but then across the disciplines, non-clinical, clinical, biostats, clin pharm, CMC, you need to have your subject matter experts in the room to engage with FDA on the key discussion points and the issues. I think generally, if you add all that up, we would typically walk in the door at an end of phase 2 meeting with on the order of 8 to 10 attendees, certainly no more than that. Although on occasion it merits having more people in the room. But generally, you're matching up your experts with the FDA's experts, and in the ballpark of about 8 to 10 is a reasonable number. Starts to get crowded beyond that, but sometimes it's useful to have extra sets of ears in the room. But that's roughly the number I typically work with.
All right, thanks, Kevin. For our next question, do you have separate CMC and clinical meetings for end of phase 2 if there's too much to discuss at one meeting? And you guys touched on this a little bit, but anything else to add on this point?
Nothing really.
Okay. All right, let's move on to the next question then. How often does FDA grant an end of phase 2 meeting within the 70-day time frame?
So this is Kevin. I'll address this one and then see if David has any perspectives. Recently, the FDA across the divisions have been doing a pretty good job of complying with the timeframes laid out in their guidance for PDUFA meetings. So generally, per their guidance, they aim for a meeting within 70 days of their receipt of the meeting request, but they do have some leeway to take that out as much as a couple of weeks after the beyond the 70-day period, depending upon the availability of the internal FDA attendees. Of course, I think everyone should be familiar with the fact that FDA has PDUFA goals for their meeting management, and so on paper, they intend to grant 90% of the meetings to occur within the 70-day time frame, plus the additional 2 weeks. So in my experience, I would say 50% of the time you might end up with a meeting within the 70 days. but I have seen meetings occur as much as 2 or 3 weeks beyond that 70-day time frame. But overall, FDA is pretty good right now in terms of trying to hit their PDUFA goals and schedule these meetings in a reasonably timely fashion. Only half jokingly, I would say that if you request a meeting during the month of August, you can probably guarantee that you're going to have a meeting during the month of September. And then I'll stop there. David, I don't know if you have any other perspectives to add.
No, I think that's comprehensive, Kevin.
All right. Thank you both for that. Next question. Throughout both preparation and participation in the end of phase 2 meeting, do you encourage or discourage expressed reference to relevant FDA guidance documents? When should you refer to such documents and when not to?
Yeah, I never refer to those documents. I think people that are unsure of the regulations or the guidance documents tend to refer to them a lot. So we'll see differences. But if you're familiar with the most current guidances and regulations, it just takes up space.
Okay. All right, let's get to a couple more questions here. Any specific advice or considerations about how to address PROs?
Yeah, I think this is obviously a coming, and it's been around for a while. Patient-reported outcomes are always part of the discussion with the design of the phase 3. Obviously, the same thing with surrogate endpoints. You're better off going with established patient-reported outcomes that you don't have to validate. If you have to get into the business of validating a patient-reported outcome in order to prove to FDA that your product is efficacious, it's a long haul. And so that would be my advice.
Okay, thank you, David. Let's try to have a couple more questions here. Should we prepare a presentation on our development program to review with the FDA during the meeting?
Yeah, this is Kevin. I'll take this one. Short answer, no. You need to have a comprehensive presentation of your development program as part of your meeting package submitted to FDA. If you anticipate or want to present, just keep in mind that you're wasting time. You have valuable limited time with FDA during the 60 minutes that you will have during your meeting with FDA, and presentations to go over your development program are just a waste of time.
All right. Okay, how about this one? How do you tell your CEO they are not invited to your end of phase 2 meeting?
Yeah, so this is David. It depends on your culture at your company. If you're in a command and control culture and you want to lose your job, then that's how you approach the CEO and tell them. It's really hard to convince CEOs in command and control culture that they're not the most important person at this meeting. However, if you have a CEO that you can negotiate with, that you can talk with, it's pretty easy. So I'm just going to say that it's not so much how you inform them whether or not they're invited or not, so much as it is they're coming and there's nothing you can do about it, and you try to do damage control. There are some CEOs that are sweet as kittens, and I have been to several FDA meetings with them, and they're fine. They know, they listen to me, and they don't open their mouth until I ask them to speak. And that can be very valuable if FDA wants to know the background of a company. If there's a CEO that wants to say why he's developing this product, that can be very influential. But CEOs that are there to get their product on the market to make money are discouraged to attend.
Okay, very good. Let's try to get 2 more questions in here. The next one is, what is involved in performing a validation study for a surrogate endpoint?
Well,
David?
sorry, I was on mute. So let's take an example of an objective response for a cancer patient. And in cancer, the ultimate clinical endpoint that FDA wants to see is survival. And so you have to do a study where you demonstrate that the objective response rate is measured in that objective response, be it something like, shrinkage of the tumor or progression-free survival. These are all surrogate endpoints that have been used. And if they are measured and the results with those surrogate endpoints mimic the ultimate outcome with survival, that means that the surrogate endpoint is valid. And you can do this for a variety of different diseases, but many diseases you can't. There is no surrogate endpoint. So to come up with a new surrogate endpoint, these days a lot of people talk about biomarkers being surrogate endpoints, but there's very few biomarkers that have ever been approved. Back in the days when HIV was first hitting, people were using CD counts, I think it was, and it turned out that products were being approved, and after time it turned out that correlation was not valid, so FDA stopped accepting that as a surrogate endpoint. And a lot of times these products are put on the market with a surrogate endpoint, but they're taken off the market if the ultimate survival result is not the same as what was seen with the surrogate endpoint. Hope that was kind of convoluted, so I hope that helps.
No, I think that did, David. Thank you very much. I think we have time for one last question here. Let's go right to it. Do you have to submit a statistical analysis plan in your end of phase 2 meeting?
This is Kevin. Ideally, you should include a full protocol as well as full details of your analysis plan to enable FDA to weigh in on your analysis approach for your planned phase 3 study and give you feedback on your analysis plan. If the details aren't laid out clearly and sufficiently in the protocol, it's valuable to have the analysis plan in place and submit that. I've seen some sponsors try to get by with just a summary of a proposed study and maybe a less than detailed synopsis for their phase 3 protocol in the briefing package. Ideally, you have both of those documents, the protocol as well as the SAP, well in hand in terms of drafting those to present to FDA, and you can just include them in an appendix to the meeting package. So while there's no hard and fast rule that you must submit the SAP, it's very helpful to include that so that FDA is fully informed.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, we'll be concluding today's webinar presentation. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Roe, and our expert panelists, David Shoemaker and Kevin Barber. We will distribute copies of the slides. And if you have any other questions we couldn't get to, you can email me at aa@endpointsnews.com, and I will forward them along to Roe. Once again, thanks for attending, and we hope to see you at another Endpoints webinar soon.